Hello, I'm Dr. Julie Brown. I'm a pediatric emergency medicine physician, and today we're going to talk about epinephrine auto-injectors and their needles and the length of those needles and the dose. Recently, there has been a lot of media attention around a coroner report saying that EpiPens have fatal flaws and are unfit for purpose. So says a coroner who presided over a pré-à-manger associated death. This coroner said that they are too short and don't deliver enough epinephrine. So what happened? This beautiful girl, Natasha Ednan Laperouse, was traveling on vacation with her family. She stopped at a pré-à-manger and purchased a baguette sandwich. She was allergic to sesame, so she checked the ingredients of the sandwich to make sure it didn't contain sesame, and no sesame was listed. And in England, where this sandwich was purchased, sesame is required to be listed in the list of ingredients. So she ate the sandwich. Unbeknownst to her, the sandwich actually did contain sesame in the bread of the sandwich. She then boarded her flight from England to France. Soon afterwards, she began to experience initially mild and then progressively worsening symptoms of anaphylaxis. She initially treated herself with a couple of doses of an antihistamine, and then as her symptoms worsened, she was given 2 doses of her epinephrine auto-injector, an EpiPen. But unfortunately, despite the efforts of her family and of a doctor on board the airplane, she eventually succumbed to her anaphylaxis and she died on board the flight. Dr. Cummings' report covered many aspects of this event, from her initial exposure to the circumstances around her care on the airplane. But with respect to her use of EpiPens, he referred to the work of the UK Resuscitation Council, particularly a guideline called the Emergency Treatment of Anaphylactic Reactions. And in reviewing this document, he appears to have relied on the expert input of an allergist, Dr. Alex Kroom. There are a couple of relevant sections in this guideline, and this is the first one, and it relates to needle length. And it says that this guidance is based on recommendations for intramuscular injections for vaccination. For intramuscular injections, the needle used for injection needs to be sufficiently long to ensure that the adrenaline, or epinephrine, is injected into muscle. A 25 millimeter or 1 inch needle is best and is suitable for all ages. In preterm or very small infants, a 16 millimeter or 0.6 inch needle is suitable for IM injection, and in some adults, a longer length, 38 millimeter or 1.5 inch needle may be needed. The other section that is relevant is a section that outlines appropriate dosing, and here it recommends a dose of 0.5 milligrams in adults and a dose of 0.3 milligrams in children under the age of 12 years. Based, therefore, on the interpretation of this report, Dr. Cummings made the following statements: that EpiPens, which have a 0.6 inch needle, are of inadequate length and are inherently unsafe. EpiPens contain an inadequate dose of adrenaline for anaphylaxis, and there are serious safety concerns. However, if you look at the context of this guideline, remember that it's for healthcare providers. It is clearly talking about intramuscular injections in the context of use in the hospital and other healthcare settings. It's comparing it to injections for vaccination, which are done with a needle and syringe. And it is describing the appropriate lengths as are typically used for injection with a needle and syringe. And if you look elsewhere in this document, it is very clear that in the healthcare setting, the expectation of the guideline is that healthcare providers are not using auto-injectors in the healthcare setting, that they are in fact injecting starting from an ampule or a vial and injecting with a needle and syringe. So these recommendations are appropriate for injection with a needle and syringe. Nowhere here does it give any mention of needle length for an auto-injector. And again, when it comes to recommendation for dosing, this is done with the expectation that this is being applied by healthcare providers in the healthcare setting. In fact, immediately following that table, there are the following statements. At the time of writing, there are only 2 doses of adrenaline, epinephrine, auto-injector commonly available, 0.15 and 0.3 milligrams. The dose recommendations for adrenaline in this guideline are intended for healthcare providers treating an anaphylactic reaction. So clearly, these dose recommendations were not intended to be applied to the use of auto-injectors. So let's back up a little bit and review the science behind needle length and dose. So let's start by looking at the auto-injectors that are available. In the United States, there are 3 brands of auto-injector. There are Mylan products, the EpiPen and its generic, which both look very similar. There is an amneal lineage epinephrine auto-injector, which is a generic for Adrenaclick, although the brand Adrenaclick is not available. And there are Kaleo AviQ auto-injectors. In other countries, different auto-injectors are available, including this product, Emerade, which is available in some countries in Europe. When we talk about needle length of these devices, we're really talking about the amount of needle that comes out of the tip of the device as it fires. And the amount of exposed needle varies by the strength of the device, which makes sense because the lower strength devices are typically used in children who are also smaller. So the lowest strength device, 0.1 milligrams, which is only available in the brand AviQ, has the shortest needle at 0.3 inches. For the 0.15 milligram devices, the 3 brands that are sold in the United States are all 0.5 inches. The Emerade is a bit longer at 0.6 inches. For the 0.3 milligram devices, again, the 3 brands available in the United States are all 0.6 inches, with the Emerade being longer at 0.9 inches. And there is a 0.5 milligram version of the Emerade, which is also 0.9 inches. Now we have to think about what it takes for the drug to get to muscle. So here we have our auto-injector firing, and it can either stop in skin, it could stop in subcutaneous tissue, which is mostly made up of fat, or it could stop in muscle. Where the needle stops depends not just on needle length, but on how much we squish down those tissues during firing and narrow the distance from skin to muscle. And we squish them down by compressing those tissues while we're pressing down on that auto-injector to make it fire. And that pressing down is required to activate the auto-injector, and how much we have to press it down is called the trigger force of that auto-injector. And the manufacturers have given us information on the amount of force required to trigger their auto-injectors, and you can see that it's fairly similar between devices, with being perhaps a little bit lower for Emerade devices. Unfortunately, we don't have this information for the Lineage generic device. The last thing we need to consider is propulsion, which is the force with which the drug is being pushed out of the device as it fires. And that force can push the drug well past the needle tip. So in order to answer the question, do epinephrine auto-injectors deliver epinephrine to muscle, we actually have 2 questions to answer. The first is, are epinephrine auto-injector needles long enough to get to muscle in all patients? And there's a subset to that question, which is, are they too long in any patients? The second question is, if the needle tip stops before muscle, as in subcutaneous tissue, will propulsion push the epinephrine the rest of the way to muscle? So to answer the first question, are the needles long enough and are they too long in any patients? We're going to look at the literature for 0.3 milligram or 0.6 inch needle epinephrine auto-injectors. There actually are additionally some studies looking at lower dose auto-injectors as well. In adults, there have been ultrasound studies that have looked at the distance from skin to muscle and whether or not that distance is short enough that the 0.6 inch needle will reach muscle. And what they have found is that even without thinking about tissue compression, the needle is long enough to reach muscle in most men, but will be too short to reach muscle in 44% of women. However, factoring in an amount of compression that is anticipated for auto-injectors used in the United States, at that point, the needle of auto-injectors are expected to be in muscle for essentially all men, but they will still be too short to reach muscle in 28% of women. They will be able to reach muscle in 100% of normal weight women, but it drops to 95% for those who are overweight and to 83% of those who are obese. Looking at children who are above 66 pounds, there's also an ultrasound study in that population, and 99% of these children would have a needle that was too short to reach muscle and would inject subcutaneously, and 3% would have a needle that was too long and would be expected to inject into bone. So in the pediatric population, you're a little bit between a rock and a hard place, because if you go shorter, you're going to have more who are subcutaneous, and if you go longer, you're going to have more who are going to reach bone. So now we know that a certain proportion of women, 28% of women, even with compression, are not going to reach muscle. And 9% of children are not going to reach muscle. So the next question becomes important. If the needle tip stops before muscle, i.e. in the subcutaneous tissue, will propulsion push the epinephrine the rest of the way to muscle? And we know a little bit about propulsion from models that aren't human models. This is a big block of ballistic gelatin. And when we fire auto-injectors into ballistic gelatin with dye in them, we know that that drug fires way deeper into that block of ballistic gelatin than it does when we inject it with a needle and syringe. But does that mean that the same would happen in a human? So there is a difference, obviously, between that uniform ballistic gelatin and what's going on in a human. You have a skin layer, you have a fat layer, and then really importantly, you have a fascia layer, which is a really tough fibrous layer that surrounds the muscle, and then you have muscle. And the question has been asked, does this fascia layer, this tough fibrous layer, act as a barrier to the passage of epinephrine if it hasn't reached muscle through the needle? And there are some studies that have been done in dead pig models, in these blocks of pork, that suggest that when you inject auto-injectors into slabs of pork, the fascia will act as a barrier and that the drug will travel horizontally across the fascia instead of penetrating the fascia and traveling deeper into muscle. However, what is happening in a dead pig may be quite different from what is happening in a live human, where the fascia actually is probably much more vascular, probably has much better blood supply than we really give it credit for. And this is a study done doing injections of a substance called iohexol, which is actually of a very similar size to epinephrine, but lights up under a CT scan. And these are living humans having CT scans done of their leg, and it shows that this injection, which was subcutaneous, then traveled quite easily through fascia and was picked up into muscle. So what we have seen in these animal models may not actually be what happens in real humans. In addition, we do know that it is possible to create auto-injectors that can blast through fascia into muscle. And we know that because there are auto-injectors that exist that are completely needle-free, that inject from the skin, through soft tissue, through fascia, and into muscle. And that has been well described. They aren't used as epinephrine auto-injectors, but they are described in other uses. So with enough force, with enough propulsive force, you can get through fascia. And here's some examples of these needle-free injectors injecting all the way, these dye substances all the way into muscle, and doing so deeper than needles and syringes do. So what does that mean? How are we doing in real humans? Well, we know for normal weight humans, we're injecting and getting nice plasma peaks, but nobody has ever done the study we need to do, which is to look at what happens when we inject with an auto-injector into obese humans where we're very likely not reaching muscle, and seeing, do we get these same nice plasma peaks? Because if we don't, then maybe the drug is not reaching muscle the way we expect. So those studies really haven't been done, and that's work that would really help answer this question better. One study that has been done is looking at whether or not people who are of increasing weight need more epinephrine than those who don't. So in this study of 361 patients, 261 of whom were children and teenagers and 60 of whom were adults, they had a range of different weights, as you can see there. And the chance of getting 2 or more doses of epinephrine did not vary by how obese you were. The healthy weight patients, the overweight patients, and the obese patients all got a very similar amount of, similar proportion of them needed 2 or more doses of epinephrine. There was a trend towards slightly fewer of the underweight patients needing more doses of epinephrine, but I don't believe that was statistically significantly different. Now, one of the limitations of this study is that most of these patients were children and teens. So it's not clear to me that there were enough patients in this study who were of an adult body size to have enough patients who were obese in a full-grown population, because an obese child might still have a shorter distance to muscle than an obese adult. So it would be really great to repeat a study like this in a fully adult population and see if it held up in that population. But that's the sum of what we have regarding needle length. So let's move on to dose. The standard dosing for epinephrine is as follows. For children, and in doses, we always use milligrams per kilogram. So it's 0.01 milligrams per kilogram to a maximum of 0.3 milligrams. And in adults, the recommendations are either 0.3 milligrams or 0.5 milligrams. And you can see how that translates into epinephrine auto-injector dosing. So we have those 3 doses, 0.1, 0.15, and 0.3. And that comes out perfectly for a 10 kilo or 22-pound child who's getting that milligram per kilogram dosing. They end up getting exactly the right dose of 0.1 milligrams. A 15-kilo child is getting exactly 0.01 milligrams per kilogram to get 0.15 milligrams. A 30-kilogram child is working out to get exactly the right dose of 0.3 milligrams. And everybody else is kind of approximating. Every other child is getting kind of the closest they can to those calculated milligram per kilogram dosing. But that's okay, because that number, 0.01 milligrams per kilogram, is actually very arbitrarily chosen. There is very little data that drives how we dose epinephrine. And if you look at experts who've been asked that question, why do we use these doses, they'll make comments like this: the origin of this suggested dose regimen could not be found. The origin of this dosing is not apparent from a search of the literature, and to my knowledge, there is actually no dose ranging studies that have documented this dose is the most appropriate. The optimal dose of epinephrine is unknown. The treatment of anaphylaxis is at best based on indirect and observational studies and primarily on consensus. So really, we have very little information that drives how we dose epinephrine and anaphylaxis. What we do have, however, is 40 years of clinical experience that this dose seems to be working well and seems to have a very low side effect profile. And there is some evidence from patients who have been given overdoses of epinephrine that giving much higher than these doses does put you into a toxic range. So we do seem to be doing something reasonable in terms of dosing for epinephrine. Next, we do have a number of studies showing that when we inject epinephrine into the thigh, we get a nice spike in bloodstream epinephrine levels. That hasn't been well correlated with a reduction in symptoms as the blood level goes up, and it would be nice to have studies that take it that additional step to show that we're giving a dose that does a good job of resolving symptoms. But we at least know that as we give that injection of epinephrine into the thigh, we are seeing a nice response in the bloodstream, at least in healthy adult men volunteers in this study. And in these studies of children, we've seen similar nice peaks with intramuscular injections in the thigh. And lastly, this is the largest study that has been done. It was part of the FDA approval process for Auvi-Q and compared the rise in plasma blood level of drug after injecting Auvi-Q versus EpiPen, and you can see with either of those drugs, again, there is a nice plasma peak after injection, again in healthy adult male volunteers. And finally, the proof is in the pudding. When a child is having an allergic reaction at home and looks like the child on the left and probably feels fairly unwell, and the family uses an auto-injector, they generally very quickly look more like the child on the right and clearly feel quite a lot better. And so it is very evident clinically that these auto-injectors are doing what it is that they're supposed to do at the current dose and needle length. There are a number of studies that have also looked at how many patients using these auto-injectors outside the hospital need one or more auto-injectors. And I've chosen to show here two fairly large, robust studies investigating that. The first is a study of patients arriving at a general emergency department where they receive both pediatric and adult patients. About a quarter of the patients in this study were pediatric. And in this study, there were 199 patients who received epinephrine prior to arrival, and 20% of those needed 2 or more doses prior to arrival. And then the second study was a study of patients arriving to a pediatric emergency department. And in this study, 234 patients received epinephrine, and 164 of them received epinephrine prior to arrival, and 12% of those patients received 2 or more doses prior to arrival. So the majority of patients who are using auto-injectors outside the hospital are only needing to use 1 dose. Although this does nevertheless speak to the fact that it is important to carry 2 auto-injectors because there are a reasonable proportion of patients who do require that second dose. In conclusion, the epinephrine auto-injector needle length is probably as good as it is going to get for a single 0.3 milligram device that is serving all patients 66 pounds and over. An even better solution would be to have different devices for patients of different body habitus. For example, we could have a husky device with a longer needle for more obese patients, and then a regular device with the current length needle for leaner patients, all offering that same 0.3 milligram dose. But given the current situation, the current needle length is probably as good as it gets. Secondly, the epinephrine auto-injector dose of 0.3 milligrams is not well studied as the optimal dose, but results in a good rise in bloodstream epinephrine levels in normal weight adult males and has a long track record for safe and effective use in anaphylaxis. And that brings us to the end of this talk. Please like and subscribe to help me get to the place where I can raise money for anaphylaxis research and maybe try to answer some of these unanswered questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention.